Welcome back to ScarletSprites, and today is a day that I really didn't think was ever going to happen. For quite a while I had voiced concern that no one had ever reproduced the Neo Geo CD pad, and I really wanted Retrobit or 8Bitdo to take a crack at this since they've been making, really for the most part, great controllers for older consoles. Like I said, today is that day. 8Bitdo made good on this and not only gave us a reproduction, they got it officially licensed by SNK as well. So first things first, let's take a look at the box and presentation. Overall, this is kind of what you would expect from 8Bitdo lately. This isn't a super premium box, but it's also a far cry from the junk packaging that you might find with a lot of third-party controllers. To me, this feels about right. Like, it's not trying to dress itself up as something it isn't, but at the same time, it's announcing that it isn't some $15 piece of cheap plastic. The inner box slides out of the sleeve, and upon opening that, we are treated to the controller and a few other items inside. And what are those other items, you might ask? Well, it comes with a manual that describes how to use the controller. Of note, it outlines how to use this with the Neo Geo Mini, which is kind of nice and addresses what I thought was one of the weakest points of that mini console, which was the controller. I really thought that that thing was junk. I despised the large throw the stick had, the non-clickiness, and the rearranging of the button layout. If you're a Neo Mini owner, buying the 8Bitdo controller is a worthy upgrade in my opinion. Further, the manual tells you how to use the controller with Windows and Android, so I suppose that those are the three systems that this is officially for, but I know you cretins really bought this for your Misters and Pies, didn't you? Also in the box is the 2.4G adapter for the controller, and yes, this is USB. It's kind of a bummer that a DB15 option wasn't available at launch, so that this could be used on original SNK hardware. I think that bummed a lot of people out, including myself. Lastly, you get a USB-C cable and a USB-A to C adapter. Alright, so let's look at the actual controller here. As a large Neo Geo fan and someone who has gone on record to say that the Neo Geo CD pad is my favorite controller from the past, how does this thing hold up aesthetically? You know I'm going to be really picky here. When I first took this out, I immediately felt like it was heavier than the original controller. Not in a bad way, not in a good way. I could just tell it felt like it had a little bit more mass to it. Like a true nerd, I decided to weigh the two here, and yes, the 8Bitdo version weighs ever so slightly more than the original. Not by much, not at all really, and depending upon how much cord you're supporting with the original, it's probably pretty even. So from a weight standpoint, I'd call this even after cracking out the scales, despite my initial reaction. The black plastic shell feels almost identical to the original. I might be tempted to say there is some very minor smoothness present on the original shell that isn't on the 8Bitdo, but that could also be from the age and the amount of use my originals have seen. The face buttons are spot on with the original controller, right down to the colors, and I'm really glad that they got this right. So I can imagine there may have been a temptation or even just a simple oversight that could have led to the coloring being a little bit more vibrant. But no, 8Bitdo nailed the muted palette that is reflected on SNK's original offering. Two shoulder buttons have been added to the top of the controller, and while some purists may not like that, and I'll admit I was kind of a less is more guy too, in this case it's totally fine. In fact, I really like it because it obviously extends the use cases for the controller to other consoles that need 6 buttons. So if you want to play some Super Nintendo with a Neo Geo controller, now you can. It was easy to put away my OCD once I felt this in my hands and recognized that the addition of the shoulder buttons didn't affect how I held the controller or its balance. Further, the black shell kind of hides them visually, so it's easy to forget that they're even there. Alright, now let's get to the first gripe, and you knew there had to be at least one. The start and select buttons. They're placed appropriately on the controller, they're rubbery, they feel like they should, but what is going on with that gross lowercase font? It's the one thing about this controller that makes it look cheap, like a Chinese knockoff. I know it's petty, but I just don't get the why behind this in the design, and it looks even worse with the plus and minus signs out in front. It's just not good. For some reason too, the buttons themselves have been changed from gray to black. That's another nitpick and something that can probably be corrected if you're really anal, but again, I don't understand the why behind this decision. The original was gray, you have the licensing, just make them gray. Someone on Twitter noted that on the box, the controller is pictured with gray buttons even, so I'm not sure why the change of heart here at the last minute to go black. Just not a fan of this. I'd take the black buttons over that crummy font though if I had to pick, but instead, we get the double whammy. Speaking of doubles too, I'm not sure why there was a need to place the SNK logo at the top of the controller with the 8Bitdo and Neo Geo logos, and then write it again at the bottom. It's just makes the face of this look so cluttered. The center of the controller has way too many words and it just looks messy. It actually may be the very reason they went with black buttons, because gray would be yet another thing to stand out on top of all the branding and labeling they tried to cram in here. So again, this is really granular and a subjective opinion from someone who is going to be picky about this controller, but this is by no means a huge flaw or a deal breaker of any sorts, but hey, I felt it was my job to call this out. All right, let's talk about what might be the single most important part of this design, the clicky thumbstick. The Neo Geo CD controller isn't the Neo Geo CD controller without the integrated micro switches. I already mentioned that the Neo Geo Mini controller seemed like it had had its soul ripped out due to missing out on this. Well, 8Bitdo says they spent 3 years recreating the clicky thumbstick for their controller, got sign off from SNK, and yeah, it really delivers. It feels legit, people. Now, I will say it feels ever so slightly tighter than my originals, and my guess there is that that's simply due to the wear and tear on those originals, and that the 8Bitdo version is just frankly brand new. It's a pretty negligible difference overall, and I'd say that if the stick stiffness on the 8Bitdo is, let's say, a 10 out of 10, then my originals are probably an 8.5 out of 10. This is in no way a negative, and I suspect the stick will loosen up after a few hours of play, and even if it doesn't, it's still totally awesome and it feels great. This is a huge win for SNK fans and anyone who wanted to experience playing with a CD pad and has yet to do so. This is pretty much perfection in 2023, guys. I love it, and I don't think I could be happier with the stick. They even put the little dot on the top of the thumbstick that indicates north. Great attention to detail on the thing that matters the most. I mean, truly, this is the single most important aspect of the controller, and the design will put all of your fears to bed. And with that big opinion out of the way, far less exciting is the switch on the back of the controller that allows you to switch between 2.4G mode when using the USB adapter, or Bluetooth if you are playing on a device that has integrated Bluetooth. Lastly, there are two other small black buttons on the controller, one with a star and the other with the 8Bitdo logo. I have no idea what these are for at the time of filming. There isn't a mention of them in the manual. I suspect at least one of them is for changing modes when connected via USB, but I haven't been able to get any feedback on that from my limited testing. All right, so with appearances covered, how does this thing actually play? I mean, that's really the most important thing, right? Outside of the clicky stick, of course. So I'll mention right away that I don't have any tools for taking objective measurements of lag, and that's what everyone is always interested in and what everyone always talks about when it comes to these controllers. Firstly, I would encourage you to look at the controllers from 8Bitdo that have been measured by Mr. Add-ons, and I'll link that chart below. And although we won't know for certain until this particular controller is analyzed, can kind of get an idea of how other 8Bitdo controllers have fared when wired versus using 2.4G. Honestly, looking at the chart, a lot of previous controllers were around just 1 millisecond when wired up. Not all, there are some variances here, but okay, 1 to 3 milliseconds wired up, and that's pretty great, and I'd expect that to be the case with the Neo Geo CD pad as well. As far as 2.4G goes, the chart shows the M30 coming in as low as 4.5 milliseconds, but most everything else pushing closer to 10, if not a little beyond. So infer what you will from that information. Basically, if you had to guess, you'd probably be safe, assuming the lag on the controller is really negligible when wired up, and then likely hovering around 10 milliseconds if using 2.4G. If you're fine with that assumption, then there likely won't be anything too surprising when this thing does get put through its paces. So in real-world tests, I chose a few games I'm overly familiar with to play on Mister via the 2.4G to kind of gauge whether or not any lag with the device was affecting my gameplay. Notably, I played League Bowling as well as Neo Turf Masters. Both of those titles are press and stop type games where timing is at the forefront of the game design, so I thought they'd be a good subjective benchmark for me. So to cut to the chase here and kill any suspense you may have had, I didn't have any issues. My scores and overall skill in each game felt exactly the way it does when I play the games on original hardware. I also frequently play these titles on Mister with the Astro City arcade stick, which itself has about 5 milliseconds of lag. I also took Metal Slug for a spin, and I played through a few levels as well as the first level multiple times, and I really felt like my overall gameplay was the same as if I were using an original controller. Again, this is subjective, but it's the best that I can offer you, and the real takeaway here is that there's nothing glaringly off with what this is doing when connected to Mister and playing the Neo Geo core. And because I know people will ask, I did try hooking this up to my Nintendo Switch and it was a no-go. So at the time of this video's creation, the controller doesn't work with a Nintendo Switch via the wired method or the included USB adapter. And that's kind of a bummer considering how many Neo Geo games are available on Switch. I also tried connecting to my Supergun and consoleized MVS via Oxenworks' USB to DB15 adapter. You guessed it, that was a no-go as well. The adapter just flat out doesn't work with the controller. Now, that's not terribly surprising considering how picky this adapter is for other controllers, and it really seems to only be a sure thing when it comes to the PS4 family. Now, in much better news, Humble Bazooka confirmed that his Neo Geo Bluetooth adapter does in fact work out of the box with the 8Bitdo Neo Geo CD pad. This is great news, and it means that we finally have a wireless option, and a pretty great one at that, for playing on original hardware. The only downside to this is that the adapter is out of stock everywhere, and you're limited to using Bluetooth. This likely increases the lag that we just talked about, but by how much, I don't know. Humble Bazooka confirmed he is hoping to restock the adapter at Stone Age Gamer in the coming weeks, so keep an eye on things there if you're interested in picking one of these up. Lastly, I'll mention there is a firmware update available for both the controller and the adapter. Make sure you enable the beta updates in the 8Bitdo firmware update software and you should see it available. The changelog is incredibly sparse and it really only says that the firmware enables use of the updater, so no new functionality as of yet. And that's really it. Overall, I'd say after just 24 hours with the controller, I'd recommend it for anyone who is looking for that genuine SNK feel. The controller is a near identical copy of the real deal. It's wireless, it feels great to play with, the stick doesn't travel ridiculously far like the Neo Geo Minis, the buttons are responsive and feel like the originals, and you may even get some extended use out of the controller with addition of the shoulder buttons. The only downside currently is that there is no official adapter for use with original hardware, and granted, I do think that that's a pretty large downside, but for those who want to use this with Mister, Final Burn Neo, or other emulators, this is really a great way to go. So that's it for today, everyone. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I will catch you all next time. Later, guys.